In my opinion today is about inheritance tax. More than 50 Tory MPs now say the tax is unfair, punishes people who have paid income tax and saved money throughout their lives and want to help their children and grandchildren financially when they die. Paul Johnson is Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Morning, Paul.
Morning.
Now, it's quite complicated, but can you just remind us how inheritance tax works or is supposed to work?
Yeah, supposed to work is probably the right way of asking it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you leave more than £325,000, then you're paying inheritance tax of 40% on anything above that. But there's an extra £175,000 in respect of the house you live in. So it's effectively a £500,000 allowance,
Mm-hmm.
and you can actually pass that on to your spouse, so that for many couples, there's effectively a £1 million allowance before you start paying inheritance tax. And that's quite complicated. The 40% rate is pretty high. The very first penny that you pay at 40%. But the problem, in a sense, or at least one of the many problems, is that if you've got a lot of wealth, 10 million, that sort of number, it's really very, very easy to avoid it. And the result is that people with $1 million or $2 million, which is a fair amount, but lots of houses are worth that in London and the South East, people with $1 million or $2 million pay a lot more tax as a proportion of their estate than people who have got 10 or 20 million. And if you've got billions, you pay very little indeed.
Because you find workarounds.
Yeah, I mean, there are some extremely easy workarounds. The obvious and the easiest one is to give cash away when you're still alive. And of course, if you've got lots and lots of cash, that's relatively easy. And if you don't, it's not. You can do very, very simple things like buy stocks and shares on the alternative investment market. You can use trusts if you've got foreign. A lot of people have some foreign connections and can use non-dom status in one way or another, or buy agricultural land. There are all sorts of ways. If you've got enough money, you can pay enough to a lawyer to make sure you don't pay very much inheritance tax.
But on the whole, this applies to very few people, doesn't it? So I looked at a stat for the tax year 1920, so a couple of years ago, and it's 3.76% of UK deaths resulted in an inheritance tax charge. So less than 4% of people will this ever apply to?
Yeah, it's a relatively small number. You can probably add a bit to that, because if you're married and you die and leave everything to your spouse, then you don't pay any tax at all at that point. But obviously, when they die, they potentially pay some money. But yes, it's only a small fraction of people who pay inheritance tax. But the point at which you do start to pay that £325,000 hasn't been increased for about 15 years now. So the number of estates being dragged in is increasing, but as you say, from a very low level.
Is that deliberate? That's got a name. Is it fiscal drag? Have I made that up?
That's exactly right, and it is. I think has been deliberate to get some more money in. Though this additional allowance for your property you live in has been introduced more recently, and that's taken more estates out of inheritance tax.
And how much goes into the government coffers every year on average from inheritance tax?
I mean, not an enormous amount. I mean, the government raises about £1 trillion a year. That's 1,000 billion altogether. Yeah. And of that, inheritance tax is about 6 billion. So it's about 0.5% of total tax revenue. So it's a pretty small amount in total. I mean, 6 billion's worth having, but
yes.
out of the total, it's not big. It's not anywhere near the big taxes like income tax and VAT and so on.
So what's the problem with inheritance tax as it stands in your view then?
I think the two problems. One is that it's a very high rate straight off. So you go from 0 straight up to 40% over 325,000. I think the bigger problem is, as I say, if you've got lots of money, it's really quite easy not to pay very much inheritance tax. So we know, for example, from the government's own figures, that the average rate of tax on a £10 million inheritance is only 10%, whereas on a £1 or £2 million inheritance, it's more like 20%. So you're paying twice as much as a fraction of what you leave if you're sort of moderately wealthy than if you're really wealthy, and it's probably much less than that if you're looking at £100 million.
So how do you prevent these kind of simple workarounds that you've mentioned for these very wealthy people?
Well, there's a combination of things. I mean, there are some very straightforward things you could do. I mean, I mentioned the alternative investment market, and you can change some of those rules relatively straightforwardly. There are other things that's much more difficult to do, where you'd have to have more radical change. So, as I say, if you've got lots of money, cash sitting in the bank, and you give it away a few years before you die, then there's no tax at all on the way we do it at the moment. Now, in Ireland, for example, rather than having tax on the estate that you leave, it's taxed in the hands of the person who receives it, irrespective of whether they receive it at death or beforehand. So, and you might think that fits better with what you want an inheritance tax for. The idea is that if I receive a big inheritance, maybe I'm the one that should be paying the tax on that. And it also gives people incentives to split their inheritances among more people, because then you're paying tax on 10 lots of £10,000 rather than one lot of £100,000, and that might be less tax per person.
We've had loads of texts about this morning, with all different sorts of views, actually. Read this one out from Graham in London. He says, I don't understand why people get so upset by inheritance tax. The government clearly needs to collect tax. And personally, I'd rather pay tax when I'm dead than pay more when alive. And it's a kind of like, it's slightly a glib point, but I think it's a reasonable point, isn't it? Because if you did, as this group of Tory MPs are saying, get rid of inheritance tax, then you are losing £6-7 billion from the Treasury, and they will need to make that up somewhere, and an obvious way would be to increase tax on the living, if you like.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the case for inheritance tax is that, if you receive an inheritance, it's not because you've done any. I mean, if I work hard, I pay tax at 20% or 40% on that. But if I'm just lucky enough to have rich parents, I pay no tax at all, and that doesn't seem terribly fair. And also, we've got very unequal levels of wealth distribution at the moment, and inheritance tax is potentially one way of reducing that inequality. It gives you a chance for social mobility. I mean, we're moving actually quite swiftly to a world in which how much you inherit, how rich your parents are, is increasingly important in your overall lifetime welfare and wealth. And that just doesn't seem fair. So you can see there's a very strong case for inheritance tax. It's a case that philosophers have been making for centuries. The reason I think that people don't like inheritance tax, apart from the fact that they know that the wealthy can avoid it, is that we're all human beings. We all want to leave our hard-earned cash to our children. So if you see it as my cash, which I just want to, maybe I've got a right to give it to my children, then you don't want to pay it. So you can see there are very strong views on either side of this, and I think it's because one side sees it as this is received by people, and it's not, through no hard work of their own, obvious thing to tax, and the other side say, well, I've saved this money, it's my money to give away without additional tax being put on it.
What would you think about a wealth tax as an alternative?
Well, I don't really think we should see wealth taxes as alternatives to what we've got at the moment. I think we've got an inheritance tax, we've got a council tax, we've got capital gains tax. None of them work very well, and we'd be much better trying to make those work before we start looking at wealth taxes. Now, it does depend what you mean by a wealth tax. I mean, a wealth tax on people with more than, 10 or 100 million pounds is a very different thing from a wealth tax on more than £500,000.
Yes.
And we might be able to get something out of the super rich with a wealth tax of, say, 1%. But I have to say, international experience is not very helpful on that. Most countries that have tried wealth taxes have found them very hard to collect, actually, rather to some extent as we find inheritance taxes hard to collect. It doesn't mean we should give up. But I think when people talk about wealth taxes, the very least they need to do is be very clear. Do they mean something on quite a large fraction of the population, including their house and their pension? I don't think that's a political starter. Or are they talking something on the super wealthy, in which case they're going to have to get that law very, very right. Otherwise, you're going to have lawyers putting occasion horses through it.
Yeah. Good to speak to you. Really interesting discussion. Thanks, Paul.
Okay, cheers.
That's Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies.